or introduction. But as you all know, Andreas is the Director of Education and Skills at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, where he leads the entire portfolio of work on education and skills. But the topic of today's conversation relates to one of his brainchildren, which is PISA. Early in Andreas' tenure, when PISA did not exist, and some of those remember those years, ministers of education used to get together to compliment each other on how wonderful things were in their countries. And Andreas and one of his colleagues, Tom Alexander, said, wouldn't it be wonderful to bring some light to these conversations, to bring some truth, and began to persuade governments around the world to collaborate in the assessment of what young people knew by the age of 15 in a way that was not specifically tied to the curriculum, so that it could also serve as an assessment of whether the curriculum was relevant, was aligned with what was needed of young people to participate in knowledge-based economies and in democratic societies. As a result of that initiative, PISA did change the conversation, because every 3 years there is an assessment, and those assessments are equated. So it is now possible not only to see how children in a given country are in terms of the level of skills of their young people in the 3 domains that PISA assesses: language and literacy, mathematics and science, but it's possible to see who's improving, who's declining, and who's stagnant. And the topic of today's conversation will be, what is it? What are the big highlights, the big takeaways from 20-some years of PISA, with a special emphasis in Latin America, where the lessons aren't so great. And they aren't so great in particular for the country where Renata, the architect of ProLEER, is located, which is Costa Rica, a country that has shown steady decline since it participated in PISA. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Andreas, who's going to make a presentation. He's going to share with us, I'm sure, some wonderful slides, and then we're going to have a Q&A. All right, over to you, Andreas. Thank you for agreeing to do this.
Thanks so much, Fernando. It's a pleasure to join you here on this. It's a really important topic of literacy. I know your primary interest has been on reading, but since our survey in its latest edition focused on mathematics, I use this as the focus. And we at the OECD or in PISA, we actually look at mathematics as part of the literacy of the 21st century. We, in a way, define literacy as the tools that you need to access culture, that you need to access our society, the resources to make a contribution in this world. And in a way, it's actually really hard to distinguish between reading literacy and mathematics literacy in that sense. You need a good combination of all of those tools to engage in a debate, on climate change or understand the evolution of a pandemic. Yeah, you need to access, manage, integrate, reflect on written information, but you also need to understand the idea of an exponential. You need to think in probabilistic terms. You need to think in terms of, and so literacy really in this broader sense is, I think, quite closely related to what I'm talking about. Let me just share my screen. I hope you can see it now. Just to start with, Latin America is actually very well covered in the PISA assessment. You can see that here in the map, with the exception of, I think, Bolivia, Cuba, and Venezuela, actually. And even in Venezuela, we had a couple of states taking part in PISA. So most of the Americas is actually quite active in PISA, and many of them are there since a very long time. Brazil, in fact, was the very first country that is not a member of OECD that joined the PISA assessment. And in fact, Brazil opened the door to many other countries subsequently joining. And in its latest edition, every time, we have capacity, for 5, 6, 7 newcomers. In the latest round, these were El Salvador, Jamaica, Mongolia, Palestine, and Uzbekistan. So you can see also from Latin America some newcomers. And let's, just start, what we have seen over the last 2 decades. And we published that in 2 volumes, looking at the state of play in education, on quality, on equity, and then on what we learned during the years of the pandemic. I think it's been a really unique historical experiment in a way. That education was disrupted in pretty consistent ways across the globe, but education systems clearly responded in very different ways. And those respondents are to some extent actually mirrored in the results that I'm going to share with you. And then, of course, over the last 20 years since we have been measuring PISA results, technology has been, one of the massive, game changers in the way we interact with information. When I went to school, literacy was a totally different construct. Literacy, was about extracting knowledge from largely linear texts. And if I didn't know the answer to a question, I could look it up in a school book and I could trust the answer I find that to be true. That was a quite convenient world. And in today's world, when you look up things on Google or ChatGPT, you get, 1,000 answers to your questions, and nobody's going to tell you what's right and what is wrong and what is true and what is not true. And it also tells you that the construct of literacy has fundamentally changed. It's no longer extracting knowledge, but about constructing knowledge now. And I say this because, while the construct, the way we use it in the real world has changed, I'm not sure that the teaching of literacy has changed that much. We're still, make young people believe what's in a school book. And then we wonder why they have such a hard time distinguishing fact from opinion. In fact, one of our last PISA assessments in 2018, where we looked at literacy more specifically, showed that it is less than half of 15-year-olds who were capable of distinguishing fact from opinion. You can ask yourself, is it so difficult to teach? Not really. You ask journalists and they say, well, I can teach you, distinguishing fact from opinion in 3 hours. It's about, triangulating information. It's about building that curiosity. It's about, building that sense of inquiry when you encounter information. Journalists tell you it's actually not as difficult, a complex set of skill sets. It's much easier than learning trigonometry. But still, we don't do that because we have still that attitude that, our job in school is to make people believe in what they see. My background is science, not reading, but I see the same in science. We teach science like religion often. We make you believe in some scientific theory, and then we give you lots of exercises to practice this, and at the end we test whether you remember the answers that we projected into this, which really doesn't have much to do with science. Science is never about, reproducing the wisdom of our times, but about questioning. Why do I say all of that? Just to prepare you for what we see in terms of results. When you actually look at the evolution of results on PISA, we haven't basically seen any changes. And it is because our approach to literacy, to mathematics, to science hasn't really evolved. We may teach more things, but I don't think, that, method of inquiry has really evolved a lot. In the last few years, we have seen even a drop. Many people are quick to say this is the pandemic. Actually, I would be very, very cautious. I actually think there are many forces, including technology, that have probably a much more profound influence on those results than, school closures. But, that's something hard to sort of dissect. But what I wanted to say also is, when you look at this, you think, well, maybe there's nothing we can do about this. But what the PISA results also show very clearly is that there's a group of countries that has actually seen quite impressive outcomes. Now, I need to look beyond Latin America, Singapore moving from good to great, keeping improving, or you can look to Macau, you can look to Japan, you can look to Estonia. Some countries with consistent, strong results, often improving. You see here Portugal. You can see Israel. Systems that also, move steadily forward. Maybe a little bit decline in the last years, but once again, in the year 2000, who would have thought that, one of the poorest nations in Europe, Portugal, would do as well or maybe better than the United States and close to the OECD average. Turkey is also quite impressive. They got a lot more young people into school. from 36% in 2003 to 74% when I look at 15-year-olds, and at the same time improving learning outcomes. In the Middle East, Qatar, unfortunately, it is the only country in the Middle East that has seen improvement. That's also, a stark reminder that money is not a guarantee for improving outcomes. Now, those countries in the Middle East often have plenty of money, also a lot of money in education, but seen no movements on quality. Now, Qatar is really the only country in the region that has been able to leverage improvements in outcomes because it started to do some things differently. In many of the other countries, we haven't seen that now, and it's oil and pizza are very hard to mix. If you dig your wells from the ground, the incentive to get people, work hard in school is harder to provide. Now, there are lots of reasons behind that, but I mean, that's one of the things that we need to see. But then comes Latin America. Actually, if you look to Peru, very impressive outcomes. If you look to Colombia, also, moving quite steadily forward. And then as Brazil, I'm already highlighted, getting a lot more people into school, and particularly in the 2000s, seeing very impressive performance gains. This actually also shows that, things can change. Unfortunately, again, those three are the only real, improvers in the Latin American region. So I think that's, but at least they show us, improvement is possible. And that gets you to the league tables that you see on the right side. They get a lot of attention in the media, but they don't fall from the sky. Each of these countries has its own history. And often the countries that you see at the top, you wouldn't have seen, half a century ago. Korea had, a less developed economy than most Latin American countries in the 1950s, 1960s. Now, at the level of GDP of Afghanistan today, one of the least developed countries, and it's actually been an impressive improver. The same would be true for Singapore. You look long enough back and you wouldn't see Singapore anywhere on the map of education, or Hong Kong. Now, I think these are really countries, when you look at the countries at the top, they haven't been there for forever, for a very, very long time. So I think those league tables always come from somewhere. And I want to bring in another dimension, and that is, how do we deal with the most vulnerable students? You can take a country like the United States, and you look at the gap between the poorest and the wealthiest students, and you can see that covers a big part of the world. You come from a disadvantaged background, well, you actually do pretty much to students in Thailand, in Mexico. You come from a wealthy background, you do as well as students in Japan and Hong Kong and so on. So huge variability. And then you ask yourself, would it need to be like this? And you can see when you take the students with the same social, migration, cultural background in Switzerland, they do a lot better. And when you take those very same students, same kind of socioeconomic, cultural, occupational background, and you put them in Macau, they actually do as well as the wealthiest students in the United States. And I think that's a really important finding in itself, that it actually shows us that we can, all young people can do well in education. I think Macau is not an easy territory. If you have ever been there, that's the kind of, casino of China. So you can imagine what that means for the working population. Now, many people work at night in precarious kind of jobs, but the society, the education system is doing really, really well to take care of the children of its country, because they know they have a one-off chance of getting this right. And you can see here, I mean, it's a really, really impressive kind of outcomes. Resilience in education is something that we always look at. And you can see actually some of the countries in Latin America are doing quite well on that. Where you actually do see there are significant shares of very poor kids doing really well in education. And I think that's something that we should also always look to what extent is a system able to transform difficult circumstances into good outcomes. And actually, you can see Latin America on both sides of the spectrum. Some countries, poverty is destiny. In other countries, it's actually possible to break that cycle of disadvantage. And I think that should teach us something. Migration is clearly a part of the agenda, and you can see many Latin American countries have seen quite steep rises in the share of students with an immigrant background. And, I think that's challenge for educators, for education systems, and a rising challenge. You can see very clearly that is a global trend in Europe, even more so than in Latin America. We also know that students with an immigrant background often come from poorer families. Now, that's very visible also in Europe. That's visible to some extent in Latin America. So that's clearly, I think, one of the contextual factors that people need to, get familiar with. But the interesting part is this, actually, to what extent does this play out in terms of results? And what you can actually see in many countries, including some in Latin America, actually, when you net out, the language and maybe the wealth of the families, actually many migrant students do better than students without an immigrant background. They pull your results up, not down, and it actually shows that often students who come from disadvantage, who come from another country, are more motivated. They have higher educational aspirations. They know that, it's their education that's going to help them advance in the country of destination. They don't have anybody else to help them. No. So I think there's actually an asset in that we often overlook in the overall results. And you can see that is actually something that's certainly also relevant for Latin America. It's probably less true for Europe for reasons that are, complex, but I think in Europe the challenges are different. And that gets us, to this overall gap that we see on gender. That's basically the blue dot, the dark blue dot. Education has done really quite well. You don't see any Latin American country where you would say, the gender gap in cognitive outcomes is dramatic. Now, most are around the parity line. It would have been different if I would have showed you that for reading. In reading, usually girls do better, consistently so. But in mathematics and science, I think education has done quite well in leveraging out gender disparities. Why? Because, for a century, we have made it a priority. Everybody understood, there's no reason why boys and girls should get different results. Let's, work on that, and education has achieved that. But as you can see very clearly here, that is certainly not at all true when it comes to social background. No? Social background is sort of the elephant in the room. And you can see, if you look to the left side, where is that worse in the world? You start with El Salvador, then you come to Panama, then the Dominican Republic, then to Guatemala. Then, you go to the other part of the world, Philippines. But then again, you end up in Latin America, Paraguay, Peru, Brazil, Colombia, Argentina. So, when you look at the education systems with the biggest social disparities, that clearly, there's something in Latin America that, makes it particularly hard for children from disadvantaged backgrounds to get to a good education. In some of the countries, that is, almost true by design. Now, if you look to Chile, wealthy parents have bought themselves out of the system. Actually, it's true in many Latin American countries that the system has made it very easy for, interested parents who have the money to find alternatives for their children. And then, you leave it for the poor to figure out for themselves what they want to do. And so that's a design feature of education, but there are other factors as well. And what you cannot say is that societal disparities are larger. No, again, if you look to income inequality, it will be a lot worse in Hong Kong than in Rio de Janeiro. No? So I think you need to look beyond that. And I think part of that is really about systemic policy, but you can find very, very few countries in Latin America that are on the positive side of this chart towards the right side of the green line, or even, beyond the benchmark of the United States, which is not a very good one when it comes to equity. this is also something, I thought really worth reflecting on. We often ask ourselves to what extent is the variation in performance that we see a phenomenon of, differences in school quality. No, there are good schools and not so great schools. Or to what extent is this something, that happens hidden beneath the surface of schools? And what you do see is in many countries, actually, there is a lot more variability of student performance within schools than between schools. And that is much harder to deal with policy-wise. There are many young people falling through the cracks of even good schools, and we just don't see it. They may even get good marks and everything because, there are ways to do this, but actually it's something that we really need to take to heart. And you can see also in many Latin American countries here that the performance variation between schools is not the dominant part of the problem. No? Different from what people might think. I was just, giving a presentation with the Colombian education minister yesterday. And, people in Colombia spend a lot of money to send their kids to private schools. Actually, when you look at the results seriously, they don't get much better, outcomes than students in public schools. No? The variability in performance between schools in Colombia is not that great. It's much more a question of performance variation within schools. No? What amazes me most is a country like, Estonia, where, the average is doing well and the closest school is always the best school. In effect, where education systems have paid, spend energy on minimizing the between school variability, usually they get very good system level results. Now, that's, I think, one of the recipes that you can have if you actually relieve parents of the burden to choose the right school and make sure that parents only have good option and that, geography doesn't play into the way you're most likely to end up with a really good system. No? And, Estonia is a good case. Iceland maybe is a little bit small to be relevant. No? But I think there are some interesting examples of education systems that show us that you can actually get good system level outcomes across the board. No? Let's have a look at money. I think that's always, a big debate, of course. No? And the link between spending and outcomes is not so obvious. If you actually look at the horizontal axis on how much do countries spend per student up to the PISA testing age 15, and how much do they achieve on the PISA scale, you can see for most Latin American countries, actually, they're on the left side, money makes a difference. Now, you can see that regression line rising very, very steeply. Now you can see here a good number of countries where that relationship is very strong, but then, it levels off. And for many OECD countries, you don't see that much of a relationship between spending per student and learning outcomes. What is also quite clear is that, most Latin American countries actually are below the regression line. I would actually say all. I can't see any exception here. Now, basically what it means, even with current resources, you would expect better results. They're all underperforming education systems given current spending. But, spending more probably would give you something. No? You can see here, Singapore and Qatar spend a lot, and Singapore does extremely well, number one, and Qatar just so-so. No? Interesting is Vietnam. You can say they do as well as the United States, but spend a fraction of what the United States invests, even after, we have already accounted for purchasing power parities. No? That's so even when you look at, real spending powers, you can see that there is a big kind of performance difference. No? And resources do matter. No? What PISA results show clearly, where you do not have, great teachers, your results are lower. Where you do not have, assistant staff, that also matters. The material resources, the physical infrastructure, the digital resources, all of that is something to factor into this. No? It's quality of resources that is often an important predictor for learning outcomes. I want to highlight one aspect that I think we need to pay more attention to in framing public policy, particularly in Latin America, and that's digital resources. I hear a lot, that the digital divide is still highly prevalent in Latin American countries. But, you also see at the other end of the spectrum, the extent of exposure of young people to technology has reached a point that it is clearly becoming an obstacle. Let me just show you a few results on that. Basically here you can see the hours of time that students spend on devices at school. On average, that's the blue part, and then the devices they use for leisure at school in hours, that's the green part. And if you compare that, with the hours they spend at school, you can see there's a good group of Latin American countries where you can say, technology is now a good half of the school day. In actually some of the countries, more. And this is already the average student. So I think that's something in the digital world has become the real world for many young people. And you can ask yourself, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? And the answer actually depends. Well, I just want to highlight here Guatemala. It's like Ukraine, one of those countries where students spend more time online than they spend in school. Yeah. How can that be? Well, the answer is that many kids are not turning up at school. In the Ukraine, they do that because of the war. In Guatemala, they do that because they don't think it's feasible for them to get to school even. No. So you can see in our contexts where actually, digital exposure can be more than time in presence. No. Particularly when you add the green part, the use of smartphones for own purposes. Now, is this a good thing or a bad thing? And this is where things get interesting, when you actually look at technology use for instruction. So this is what teachers do. You don't see much of a relationship. Now you can see some countries in which this line would go up and some where it would go down. But overall, you don't see as much of a relationship between technology intensity and learning outcomes as you would expect. No? And one interpretation is that often, technology is not used in a very different way than you would teach in traditional ways. So you not expect different outcomes. No? But what you see very clearly across countries is that the use of smartphones by students themselves, intensity of that is steeply negatively related to learning outcomes now. And this effect is bigger than the effect of the pandemic. Now, and it will stay with us. The pandemic, hopefully, not going to be there again, but you have the smartphone use. If we don't, figure out how to handle that effectively, there could be a big disruptor and a big kind of obstacle to learning. And it's very consistent across countries. You don't see any country where you can say, having smartphones in school is something that, improves outcomes in any form. One of the reasons why this is a problem is, distraction. And you can see, again, Latin America at the top end. If you look to here, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, those are the top 3 countries. Over 50% of students say, I can't concentrate. I get distracted by using my smartphone or by my classmates using their smartphone. And it is something I think that is, getting at, very high levels now. And you ask yourself what you can do about it. And this is really interesting. First of all, you can see that distraction rises, almost exponentially with time use. Now, the more students use their smartphones, the more they get distracted. And it's not a surprise. But then, what you can do about it. Interestingly is, whatever teachers said to their students doesn't seem to have much of an impact. Students seem to be very good in ignoring what teachers tell them. What the school principal, pronounces as a school policy also doesn't have much of an impact. So schools, in one way, technology has probably become so addictive that, it's very, very hard to dissuade people not to use it. The only thing that has a measurable impact is the red bar, is the ban on smartphones. Now, when you basically make it physically impossible for students to bring them, then you can say you see less of a negative effect. But, it's a question whether you want to go that route. I think that's something that, in a world, it may help you temporarily, to get up to speed with this thing, but in the long run, it's probably not, the kind of solution you aspire to. But it's really interesting that, most negotiated solutions, most things that teachers and school leaders discuss with their staff and their students seems to be too weak to the temptation to use your smartphone. A level of addiction is also quite clear in the next slide. When you look at actually, the share of students who feel anxious when they don't have their devices near them, here Malaysia and Turkey, actually, where that is also a significant minority now. And very clearly, where students, are dependent on their smartphones, they are doing less well in mathematics. But it's not the end of the story. They also feel less happy with their lives. They feel less in control of their emotions. They feel less resistant to stress. So, and this is something where I want to bring in, literacy, because I know that is your focus. And it's a really, really interesting chart that I'm showing you now. We often assume that, if you want to make people digitally literate, give them access to technology. That's why you, learn to browse information, to search and, critique, contrast. All of that is what you learn in the digital world. So we equate digital exposure with digital literacy. But when we looked at the PISA results, we found something really different. What was the best predictor for digital literacy is actually the share of students who read books in paper format. Whereas students who read material in digital format on digital devices score worse the more often they did that. So think about it. We see that, reading paper material seems a better predictor of digital literacy than reading digital material. And it gets even more interesting than that. When we ask ourselves, who did best on digital literacy, it tended to be students who had read books in a last school year of 100 pages or more in the school. How can that be, that reading long books makes you more digitally literate? I can only hypothesize, we don't have a clear explanation. This is a puzzle that remains with us. But, maybe digital literacy has more to do with you engaging in a complex, long story than, reading snippets of information on the internet. When you read a novel, you have to immerse yourself in different characters. You have to look at, their different perspectives. You have to look at their different arguments. You have to actually build a quite complex mental representation of a story. Now, it's not easy to actually keep all of that in mind and, process all of that information. And maybe that is what makes us digitally literate, rather than you're reading, 1,000 X messages. So I think, we should, think harder about the type of literacy skills and the type of reading exposures that prepare us back for the world of tomorrow. At least, I'll leave you with this puzzle. It's, I think, not something that we have a clear answer to, but I do think when we talk about, how do we teach literacy in the world of tomorrow, the many people who say, well, we should have less fiction and more document, tables, charts and things. And I agree, this is very important. But, if we lose the novels, if we lose the long documents, the complex arguments, maybe we lose out on what we actually want to achieve, namely to have young people who are capable to navigate complex sources of information. Very quickly, just a couple of slides on teachers and teaching. And I must say, this is an area where, probably when we analyzed the PISA data, we've had some disappointments. During the pandemic, I think many people had this idea that teachers, were superheroes. They really, went the extra mile to take care of their students. But when we surveyed the students themselves, actually, it is not that great. In many Latin American countries, you have a good share of students who say, well, I felt really lonely. during the pandemic, or I didn't feel that my teacher was present when I needed help. Look at the results for Argentina and so on. So and very few countries on the right side of the chart are in Latin America. So I do think lack of teacher support is something that we should struggle with. How can education become more of a social relational experience rather than just a transactional business? And it's clear that many students in Latin America did not have that kind of sense that the teachers were present, available, understanding them. Work organization of education in Latin America is often very transactional. Now, you teach a subject, you spend very little time with students outside the classroom, to be a coach, to be a mentor, very different from, what you see in Asia, where teachers do spend a lot of their time with individual students. And again, this picture was, in stark contrast with the image that, we generated in education through the pandemic. And I must say, we too, as at the OECD as well. And why do I tell you this? Because our data show is that where students feel that their teachers were available when they needed help, they were much more likely to be autonomous learners. They were, that personal relationship to your teacher, that perception of support is one of the best predictors that we have on students feeling confident with their learning. And also, one of the best predictors for student performance. Now, when you ask yourself how much homework did students have during the pandemic, did they did part in Zoom lessons, all of those things did not have that much of a relationship with outcomes, but that perception, my teacher was present for me, or someone in the system, had a huge impact. I can tell you, on average, across Latin American countries, 11% of 15-year-olds said, my teacher asked me how I am. Most of them would have told you, I got homework, I got Zoom lessons, I got everything. But only a small minority of students had a teacher talking to them, how are you? Not a difficult question to ask, but it seems to get lost in, increasingly transactional education systems. And that brings me to this point on parents. Now, what you can see very clearly is that parental support is also declining in many Latin American countries. And some countries in the region is still quite strong, and others is weak, but in all of the countries is on the decline. And that, again, is an indicator of concern. We know that parental care, parental interest, engagement is a huge determinant of student success, much more important than parental income. And again, we see it moving in the wrong direction in most of Latin America, and actually most of the OECD countries as well. So I think that's not an issue. Little look at learning beyond academics. Now, when you ask people, are you happy with your life? You would think for 15-year-olds, the last people who make you happy are your parents or, your school. But actually, when you look at the data, you can see is that the relationship with parents and the life at school are the two strongest predictors for students being happy with their lives. And this shows you how much of a role school really plays in, getting students ready for life and making them, comfortable with their life, giving them that sense of belonging. And you can see that here in many Latin American countries, and actually, I must say in all of them, you can see below average sense of belonging. And that is something that we should, again, be of concern with, because if school is not a place where you make friends, where you feel you belong, where you feel, a sense of identity, then, school doesn't play a big part of its role in our societies. Now, and when you look here on the left side, of course, you also find other work regions now, but I think it is very striking to see that virtually all of the Latin American countries are on the left side and none of them on the right side now. And I'm going to skip all of that. Maybe I should talk a little bit about mindset as well. On this chart, you can see on the vertical axis the student performance. The higher the dot, the better the country comes out on PISA. And on the horizontal axis, you see an indicator of student growth mindset. In a way, do I believe that, if I try hard, my teachers are going to help me and I'm going to be successful, as opposed to it's all about the intelligence I was born with. And again, when you look at most Latin American countries, Brazil is maybe a little bit of an exception, Chile as well, you can see that students still often have a fixed mindset. The message to students often is, you're not good enough, we make things easier for you, we send you to lower performing school, rather than saying, look, we're going to redouble our effort. We're going to make it, challenging for you. We're going to help you to succeed. And that growth mindset is incredibly influential on success. What you can see, it doesn't only work at the individual level. That's what you would assume. It works that way as well at the system level. Now, education systems with more of a growth mindset seem to be consistently performing better. What does this say about cause and effect? I don't know. That's not so clear. But what you can see clear is a pattern that education systems doing well on growth mindset tend to be also high-performing education systems. So again, the inspiration that education provides for students, the support it gives them, the belief that they can overcome challenges, is probably very, very influential. And, it actually works as at different levels of this. And then there are other things, curiosity, persistency, emotional control, stress resistance. Now, all of those things also matter. The counterpart for student well-being is, bullying, violence in school. And what you can see here is when you look at the countries with the least sense of safety, they're often also in Latin America. You can see, Switzerland and Austria are the role models. Every student feels safe. School is a wonderful environment. But when you look at Jamaica, when you look at, Cambodia and many other countries, there are big, big concerns. And it matters because what we see clearly is where students do not feel safe in school, they are less happy with their lives, they have a lower sense of belonging, they have less confidence and in the learning and so on. Now, very last slide, we asked also students when they were not present for a long time, why they had been absent. And then you can see the top reasons are, I was sick. Now, that's obvious, you can't be in school when you're sick. But the next ones are interesting. I did not feel safe at school. No, that is the second most important reason. And the third one is, I felt bored. No? And I think we should clearly be able to do something about it. No? Summing up, some lessons from the pandemic. Obviously, school closures were not a great thing. That has been something that has made it much harder to reach students, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds. Investing more in self-directed learning, in the close relationship between students and teachers. Now, this learner autonomy is something that clearly was a big asset in some education systems during the pandemic, and I think everybody needs to invest a little bit more on that. Strengthening the foundations for student well-being, for safety, that sense of belonging. And it's not very hard to do. Actually, what I was surprised is how little it takes. It is that 5 minutes that teachers spent with the students in person that can make all of the difference. We've got to do something about the digital distractions. I think this is not going to go away. And then, the partnerships with families, parents' involvement in student learning at home, at school, building better bridges between school. Not so much an issue in Latin America, institutional stratification. That's more a European problem. The only point I would make here is grade repetition. Now, grade repetition that is still quite prevalent in Latin America is also a form of institutional stratification that reinforces the impact social background has on learning outcomes. And so doing something about it will be good. Now, very clearly for most of Latin America, how can you better align resources with needs? Introducing formula-based funding methods, making sure that you attract the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms. Those are clearly things that can be done. They're not resource intensive. They're not about spending more. They're about, being smarter and spending. And then also, how can schools become stronger agents in their communities and societies. And there's just a few kind of highlights, and of course you can find all of that in our PISA research. But I have exhausted my time, so I stop here and look forward to any questions.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I thought you were just beginning, just getting started. This was great. So we're going to open it up for Q&A. And if I may, let me start with 2 questions, and I'm going to try to be provocative. I think that one of the greatest contributions of PISA, the first one, is that it actually defined a high bar for literacy. The literacy test of PISA is really a test of critical reading, of critical thinking. It's not just about comprehension. It's not just about fluency. It's about, can you think about the internal coherence of the arguments that you're reading? Can you think about the coherence between those arguments and everything else you know about it? The current conversation, as you know, in the global community is about foundational learning. But I'm not 100% sure that foundational learning and the kind of literacy skills that PISA measures are actually the same thing. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about those 2 ideas, where the global conversation is, what PISA measures, are we measuring the right things? And then the second question, and I'll stop, is it seems to me that when you look at the correlates of performance of PISA, we have a lot of information on things that can be influenced in the short term. You know, you can offer more PD to teachers. You can emphasize these things or those things in PD. You could regulate exposure to devices. Maybe you can even provide books to kids. But there are some things that are harder to do in the short term, but perhaps are really very important to talk about, like the careers of teachers. Who becomes a teacher? Who do we accept into this profession? And I have a sense that a lot of the current conversation, for good reasons, avoids the latter set of topics. I don't know whether you're going to get kids to read, engage with complex arguments and read books that have more than 100 pages if the teachers themselves can't do that. And I can see why schools of education, teacher professional organizations have a hard time engaging with those issues because they are part of the problem. When in places where people stop joining the profession, schools of education still need to run their business. So they admit people from the bottom of the barrel and they graduate them and they go there and they teach. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the emphasizing the structural factors, teaching careers, which have proven to be extremely difficult to change and to sustain those changes over a long time. So let me stop there and give you a chance to respond, and then we'll take more questions.
Yeah, no, I think these are certainly really, really good questions. You know, on the first question, I must say that I'm, personally a little bit concerned about this notion of, foundational literacy. It's a little bit like saying, okay, you first have to make learning very boring and procedural, and then you get to interesting thing. And in that way, we lose many young people. They'll never get started. You're not going to get them over that hump. The second point is, foundational literacy is ChatGPT. If you actually get to that level, you're not even touching what makes us human. And you do not even touch our capacity to, complement the artificial intelligence we've created in our computer. So, and that's why we set that bar very high from the very beginning. And we were often criticized for this. You get well beyond the horizon of what many people may achieve by age 15. And that is what our data show. At the very same time, I think the bar should not be set what is realistic or what is easy to achieve. The bar should be set, but what will our societies need? And I very much worry about young people who have maybe technical reading skills, but who cannot use reading for learning, who cannot use reading for, navigating ambiguity, who cannot use reading for, building, a critical reflection in argument. And I think, this is one of the concerns I have, and this, I think, almost goes back to also the way we allocate grades to people. We often make a normal distribution. We say, okay, these are the students we have. Let's give the better ones a good grade and the worst ones a worse grade. No, actually, I think we need to set the bar by what young people will need to be successful in tomorrow's world. And I think the level in which we have set, level 2, for example, on PISA is, the lowest possible bar that I could sort of see, working in real life for real people. And I don't think it's very ambitious. I actually think it's just the threshold where you get beyond the technical skills and start to see literacy as something that engages you. And I also think, when we teach literacy, maybe you still struggle technically, but if you do not see enjoyment in reading, if you do not see how literacy opens, new avenues, new doors, new perspectives, new images for you, I think you're going to have a hard time getting a lot of people, spend time and energy on reading, which is actually what makes you fluent. On your second question, I very much agree with you. We are always, tempted to sacrifice the important for the urgent because, it's so much more convenient, and education is a very conservative social enterprise. Let me just, I share my screen again. I want to just, highlight the way I frame this, and I had not planned that for this discussion here. So let me just, share my own thoughts on this. What you can do is, look at what's easy to do and what really is very difficult and very challenging to do, and then you can look at what actually makes a difference in our societies and what may be not so important. And often, and we of course want to do things that are easy to do and very important. I have no doubts about that. We want to avoid things that, cost a lot of time and energy and may actually not have so much of an impact. And unfortunately, that is not at all empty as well. I think there's a lot of resources in education going in things that, may be popular, but not really moving the needle. And then, there are some low-hanging fruits, and I think we definitely should pick them up, what we can do easily and what may not be so important, but, doesn't cost very much. But then, you make that really important point. We have to move the needle. We have to get into the things that are really difficult to do and make a huge difference in the long run. And, if I just put, my take on that, what we can do quite easily is to become better at understanding what our societies need. What literacy do we need in this year, in 10 years? I actually think that is not such a hard task. Some people in curriculum design are good at that, many are not. But I think this is something I would still think is a quick win to give, a compass, an orientation in education. Curriculum, easy to do. Instructional system, and that's where things get harder. How do you actually do what you say in the curriculum, and build a kind of incentive support for teachers to deliver that? Very, very difficult. Stakeholder engagement. Now, what is very clear is where educators are not involved in the design of the system and their careers, it's very hard to move anything. Technology, I don't put it as high as others do. I don't think it has proven itself yet to be the kind of game changer that we all want it to be. And where I put, a lot of emphasis is really the work organization. You talked about teacher career, getting the right people, educating them well. It's actually a lot to do with the kind of work environment that we provide. Just paying people higher salaries doesn't get you a different type of people. Now, it's really about, how do you foster, genuine professional autonomy? How do you build a more collaborative culture in education? Sort of how do you create a work environment that, has interesting career, aspirations for people, that, makes the job, intellectually attractive, not just financially attractive. And I think this is hard to do, but really, really important. Aligning resources with needs. How do you get the teachers with the greatest capacity serving in the schools where they are most needed? It's really, really important. Not as difficult as it often seems, but clearly, in that yellow zone. Building capacity. Now, this is about, not just initial teacher education. This is about, that whole idea that teachers, need to be good mentors, good coaches for each other, that they need to work in professional learning communities, that they need to, be embedded in, very supportive culture. And then, leadership, is often the, elephant in the room. great people will only work in places where they have great leaders and inspiring leaders and committed leaders. And then, the rest you can distribute incentives and accountability. We know how to build those things, often overestimated. Making education more efficient with technology. I also would say, yeah, easy to do, but, don't expect that much from this. And then on the right side, particularly for Latin America, there's been an overemphasis on volume. Actually, I didn't show you a slide on productivity, but most of the Latin American countries are what we call low productivity systems. Students spend a lot of time learning very little. And I think the response has often been, let's give more time. And that's, I think, not really, I think, what you can see. So this, would be my long response to your question. Finding a better balance between what is important and what is urgent in education.
Thank you very much, Andreas. We're now going to take some questions. Let's begin with Renata.
Me unmute myself. Thank you for a really very provocative, very stimulating presentation. I think one of the questions that sort of a simple question that comes out in looking at results in Latin America and looking at results around the world is some countries just participate in the PISA. They go through the motions every 3 years to participate. They share the results, and then for 3 years they forget about it. Other countries seem to participate and actually use the PISA, as you've explained, the tool was designed to really be a tool of continuous improvement. And I'm wondering if you can talk to us about what does that look like? What does the difference look like? When you see countries, you've mentioned a number of countries in Latin America and outside of Latin America that have actually made continuous improvements over the past 5 PISA assessments. What are the kinds of systems techniques or systems practices, really, that you see in countries that systematically improve or at least remain stable while the trend lowers? I'm wondering if you could talk to us about that. Thank you.
I think, probably there's a combination of a lot of things. And I do believe political leadership matters a lot. Do you dismiss, problematic results, or do you embrace them? You had leaders, like President Cardoso in Brazil. Again, they were the first country joining this. They knew where they would come out. They knew that they would end up as the last country in this comparison. He told me that, very clearly when we had this very first conversation. But they said, look, it's time for us to see, the truth, and then do something with it. I would say the same. You take someone like Jaime Saavedra in Peru. I think same story. You had people there who said, look, we will go through this. We want to learn from and with our kind of peers and become part of that global community. I think that leadership issue is important. But it's probably the more obvious thing. But I think there are other issues, and sometimes it's about research capacity. Finding people who can turn data into action and socialize those data. It's not a trivial thing to do. How do you actually turn results into a delivery chain? What are the intended, the implemented and achieved kind of things that you need to put in place? And often ministries of education are very, very thin on that. And I would not just say Latin America. Go to the 7th floor of the Department for Education in the United States, and look around in the offices. Who actually deals with strategic questions? Questions around the what in education. What should our kids learn? Questions around, what is the latest research actually showing us? And you'll find, a handful of people in a huge country. And I think Latin America is no different. And I think that is very much, and research institutions sometimes help with that. That's great. But I don't think we have a very systematic kind of link between, evidence and policy. And maybe even practice. How many teachers genuinely believe that their everyday practice will be changed by evidence and research. How many teachers genuinely believe that education is at least as much of a science as it is an art? And so I think, building better interfaces between, evidence, capacity, policy, I think that in itself is at least as important as collecting the data. And some countries have done a good job with it. I must actually say, in Latin America, I've been very, very impressed. Colombia, since it joined PISA, has been, they also had great institutions helping with this, and institutions like ICFES, ICFES in Colombia, INAPI in Brazil, they are, game changers in the system. They are actually almost the conscience of public policy. They have a good level of integrity and independence. They don't change when public policy changes. And I think, but again, you look around Latin America, you don't find that many players. Mexico has undone what it had. It had, I think, a quite functioning infrastructure. It no longer has. So it's not, easy.
Thank you. Armida.
Hello. Thank you so much for your presentation. I have a really quick question, a little bit on the same line that Renata's question was. It's coming from Peru, it's about the same thing. No, every 3 years we have the results and there's nothing in the middle. So if there was a takeaway, what is a takeaway from a country or a system or a school district where you can choose one thing where you can start? Because we had Jaime Saavedra, but he left. And now I feel we don't have data to guide what we're doing, or we don't see anything coming from the Ministry of a plan, especially after COVID. So if you had one takeaway of something that we can, where we can improve our system, what would it be?
Yeah, again, you don't choose your leaders in education. So I think that's sort of the hard part to change. But I think actually in the education system, building stronger networks among educators is something you could do today. I don't think you need to wait for a great minister. You could actually, better. In most Latin American countries, teacher organizations are very much industrial organizations. They worry for salaries, working hours. They're not actually very much engaged in the professional discourse. And that, would be an obvious thing to do. And the more you invest in that, the more you build a kind of strong body of professionals who actually take ownership of the education system, the less perhaps you worry about who happens to be the minister. I think you can actually building that stability bottom up, in a country, in a context of Latin America where institutions generally are weak. That's at least my reading of it, where public policy is volatile. Your best bet probably is to rely on the people at the front line and, connect them well, organize them well, and give them, the tools to learn from and with each other. In a way, if I would turn to a country where this could be really interested, is Vietnam. Vietnam has less institutional capacity, or had less institutional capacity than most Latin American countries. And they did not go about and say, okay, we have to build first, world-class universities, then we have to build, teacher training institutions. They more or less, build a kind of digital infrastructure that got teachers connected. And then, they, got, curated kind of sources of, education material. And then, the better teachers became more visible in the system, and they become the mentors of teachers who were, and so the system really built, a huge kind of talent pool. We are connected. And I think probably in that institutional context, that's not what depends on anything from the outside. I think the education profession, other professions do that among themselves. Scientists in Latin America work really well with each other. I don't know about, lawyers and administrators, but I think actually in many professions, there is a kind of professional ethos of how can we, work together. And I think in education, you would gain a lot by getting, if your teachers in Peru know what teachers know elsewhere, you would have a very different education system.
Catherine Snow.
Catherine, we need to unmute you, or can you do that?
Yes, hi, thank you, Andreas. Very nice to see you again after just a couple of weeks, or maybe a month. And I enormously appreciate your ability to take this huge data set that you have overseen the collection of and probe it for responses to very specific questions of interest to different groups. I want to go back to a point that Fernando raised in his second question, I think. There is enormous tension in talking to folks in low income, low middle income countries about the right distribution of emphasis on early reading skills which are tempting because you can get good results with them relatively easily with standard, fairly simple interventions. And the later reading skills, which I entirely agree with you, are the ones we really care about as a society, the ones that will build an informed citizenry and productive economies. And I struggle with this a lot, and I wonder if you have any insights about how one expresses in an appropriate way two things in a way that comes across to educators and policymakers in these countries that are trying so hard to show that they're going to make improvements. One is that the foundational skills are crucial but insufficient for producing the later skills, for leading to the later skills. And the other is that precisely the educational activities that we would like to see going on for older students need to go on in developmentally appropriate ways for preschool and primary grade students, namely talking about big questions, engaging in discussions, probing texts for whether read aloud or read for evidence that they're correct or that they're reliable. So how do you, when you talk to educational policymakers around the world, how do you bridge that gap and fill in those holes in their understanding that no, first you learn to read words and then you learn to read texts, which is exactly the wrong way to think about it?
Yeah, I think very, very good point. I'd like to distinguish, between approaches and strategies, which I think what the bulk of your question is about, and resources. When it comes to resources, Latin American countries are hugely tilted to older people. If I could name you countries in Latin America which spent, 7 times as much for high school student than for early childhood education or even primary education. I mean, that just makes no sense. I think, the imbalance for spending a lot of public money for people who have survived the school system, also in university, and not insufficient attention to the foundations of education, I think is something that goes right across Latin America. Very, very different from other regions of the world. But that is a very, very different story than, what should we be learning? And I think, the first thing I try to explain to policymakers is that this notion of foundation skills was an entirely appropriate concept in the industrial age. If we're honest, in the industrial age, we needed a few really smart people, few well-educated people who run the system, and a lot of people who work with machines and who are compliant with industrial kind of cultures and standards. So, it actually made perfect sense to, just sort people, get a few people at the top of the pyramid and a lot of people with foundation skills. And that paradigm has fundamentally changed. And that's something I think the policymakers need to see, that actually in today's economy and society, you are, almost your entire, and it's not just about economic well-being. Whether you have a functioning democracy depends on whether people can, make sense out of complex processes, whether they can, have their voice, have their say, understand difficult arguments, make better trade-offs between the present and the future. And that is all about, advanced literacy. And, where I think we need, through research, be more convincing is that, this notion that this is a ladder. First you have to read in very boring terms, a word, and then, you can read a sentence, and then you can read a text. That turns many young people off. You can speak to children in kindergarten and engage them in actually fairly complicated arguments, and actually they love that. I actually think if all what we would achieve in the first years of schooling is to get young kids curious in learning and to get them interested in, questioning and querying and, struggling with things, we would have achieved a lot more than building, tools and very simple kind of procedures. And I think we don't do very much. I have only data for Colombia, in Brazil, but in both of those systems, we see that 15-year-olds in Colombia and Brazil are less creative than 10-year-olds. If I would tell you your 15-year-olds do worse in mathematics than your 10-year-olds, you would say I'm crazy. Schools is adding a lot of skills. But actually, when it comes to some of the skills that really matter, our compliance-based culture and education diminishes some of those, tools that we were born with. The most creative people, the most entrepreneurial people, they are all kids in kindergarten. And I think we better learn from how they learn best, and then build our school systems around that than, pushing a school culture that was built still on selection down to the early years. So I actually think, for me, it doesn't matter whether, children completely understand, a literary text, but, can they engage with an argument? And sometimes, you make that in a different way. I think that creating that curiosity, creating that interest, that inquiry to struggle with difficult problems is something that, and you can see that perfectly in the literacy results for Latin America. Also in the numeracy results, students are usually good at the reproduction of subject matter content of procedures. When they know exactly what the nature of the problem is, they solve it. But they have great difficulties in engaging with unstructured problems, in engaging with open-ended tasks. And that's what the world today is about. So I really think changing that culture is very, first of all, to create the value proposition for public policy, in today's age, is about everybody's success. And then second, that, the best way you build, strong skills throughout life is by getting people to become self-motivated, curious people. No.
Thank you. Beatriz.
Hi, Andreas. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think it's very thoughtful and brings a lot of things to think around. I will try to be very focused on my question. And I think that we have so many challenges to face in education. And we have to find the mainstreams that we can follow on to start making systemic changes. And I think that understanding the process of the teacher training, the professional development, as the main tool that can tackle all those problems you mentioned around. And in my perspective and in my experience that I work with that, is that it's not valued. The research about implementation and to learn about teacher training processes as a mainstream path that we can tackle all the problems we are having. So I think we have to discuss a little bit the role of the university, not only on of course, the basic research and the research about how children learn and all that. It's very, very important. And we have to go to that source to implement projects, but there's no value about studying the implementation process in a systemic perspective. How can you change a system at the same time that you are improving the pedagogical reference in the classroom? So I think here we have something to understand and to make a little advocacy on about the importance of the research, that kind of implementation. And also another part, I just we just lost with Michael Walton, who is a professor at Harvard, a grant exactly to study the scaling up process, which is not obvious. And usually when we are worried about systems, we go straight from a little experience to a scaling up process, and we fail because we have to understand that. So just wanted to provoke this kind of discussion and understand your views on that.
I think you have asked the question, and actually, I think given a large part of the answer, I agree with this. I think one of the things that we often underestimate is, in the implementation, you need to be clear about your stakeholders. If this idea that you have a good idea and can roll it out to everybody tomorrow is just nowhere working. If you had a successful product, like the next iPhone or whatever it is, the first thing these people do is they get a very small group of people who are really, really keen on that product, who really want to make it work, and who buy something that is maybe overpriced and, maybe not working perfectly, but they're willing to sort of experiment with this and, become the champions of this. And you need to find them. That's basically incredibly important. And then, these people need to build a kind of early, adopters and early majority. I mean, a group of people who intrinsically want to make something work. You cannot push a rope. And that's what we often try to do in policy. And you do not push anyone outside their comfort zone. The first people who, buy into this really need to be motivated. They need to be, intrinsically rewarded. And you find plenty of those people. There's no shortage in education of people who want to do a really good job, who want to go the extra mile. And so many teachers and school leaders who are amazing. So finding them, building them into that process, making them part of the design of reforms. If you, sit in an ivory tower and, design a new reform, and then tomorrow you go to the television and say, oh, this is the big solution for all our problems, nobody's going to follow you. No. If you ask yourself as a leader, to make real change, don't ask yourself, how well people follow your prescription. Ask yourself, how well can your people collaborate? Build your, early adopters, your early majority, and then, work towards a tipping point. How you can actually, then, at some point gain the momentum for real change. And I think this is where universities can play an incredibly important role, that they can actually become the catalysts of those kinds of processes. But that's often forgotten. We still have a very industrial model in education. We believe, some policymakers can, know and decide what millions of people will learn and how millions of teachers will teach. And that, you don't find any example in the world where this has ever been successful. Not even, often we say, well, if you have an autocratic kind of system, those things will work. They don't work there either, actually. So I think thinking more carefully about, how do you actually, build momentum and first inspire people. What inspires people is never the what. What inspires people is always the why. If you do not understand and own the value proposition of change, you very quickly lose your way on implementation. Certainly when the next government comes in place, that's the moment when you get off track. Now, if you want to actually stay on that mission, you have to inspire people with the value proposition. Why are we doing this? And what are we going to achieve with this? And then, give them a voice and a role in designing the reforms. Now, I can tell you this, for 30 years, I've followed exactly that process. For 30 years, I have asked myself that one question, what has worked in what context at scale? And that is, what I, come to the conclusion.
Elisa.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you, Andreas. It's great to see you again. And thank you for all you said today. Many things come to my mind, but I want to say that PISA, it's 15 years old, is what they need for the future, but so much happens before they are 15-year-old. First of all, I've been thinking, because of the work I've been doing, of the results of UNESCO with the primary children in Latin America. 3 out of 10 or almost 4 now after COVID, do not read and write by the age of 9, and they're already in 3rd grade. So, I mean, are you liaising with UNESCO, with others, I mean, to know more about what's happening much earlier? Because I totally agree about curiosity, but I think they need to read and write. I mean, if they don't have that very basic skill, then we have a problem, a very serious problem. The second issue is I've been looking at as well is who are the teachers that have been prepared by the teacher training colleges, and they're entering these colleges with very, very few literacy skills themselves, both in language as well as mathematics. And that is a problem, because the teachers that are coming out of the teacher training colleges, I would love to see what sort of level they are at PISA. I mean, could we say what's the least level they need in PISA to be able to be a teacher? Because that is happening. And the other thing, you mentioned that Mexico's lost some of their policies. I mean, at one point, we were able to put a lot of books in primary schools, in secondary schools, in preschools, both for school libraries as well as for classroom libraries. I mean, all those things that are supposed to be basic conditions for what should happen at 15-year-old. What are your take on those three sort of foundations?
These are all big questions. And I don't disagree with this notion of early literacy. I just would again repeat, I think we shouldn't underestimate what small kids can do in the right context. I mean, look at Sugata Mitri. He puts a computer in a wall, and suddenly kids become self-motivated learners and readers and everything. It's not very difficult. And I think, again, if we go into this with the notion, I teach you a set of procedures, wherever you come from, whatever your interest, you will run against a brick wall. I think that's something, I think where we should, probably do more to, get teachers in a mood, understand who their kids are and getting them interested, and then, exposing them to the right learning environments. But your point on teacher education is spot on. I have my own hypothesis where many teachers would come out on the PISA assessment, and not because they know little in the subject they teach, but because in PISA you have to think along the paradigms of your subject. You have to demonstrate that you can think like a mathematician. And I would actually say this is the fundamental prerequisite for you to teach mathematics. If you do not understand the ideas, the concept, the ways of thinking of a mathematician, you'll be a very bad mathematical teacher. You'll just teach people, to rehearse procedures. So, and I have my own hypothesis, but the question is how to get there. If you today reform universities and get better teacher education, that's the tip of the iceberg. It's going to take you 40 years until those people will enter into the teaching profession. I think, that is where we need to start with the people who are in the profession, build, strong networks of mentorship, build that, learning framework into the design of the work organization, that, it's natural for you as a teacher to grow in your profession. And again, is that so difficult to achieve? Well, again, you look at countries like Vietnam, parts of China, this is how they have revolutionized their teaching profession. They started with incredibly poor teacher capacity, and they didn't say, well, I wait for a spaceship that brings me new teachers from some university. They actually started out with the people who were working in the classrooms, and then, ask themselves, who's doing a great job, who's recognized by their peers, how we can actually leverage their expertise. And I think we did this old model of, believing that there's some institution that can build and raise teacher capacity. I just think that the pace of change is so much slower than what we need, is that we need to, change the model. And I think, having a good, a more active work culture in the teaching profession, create incentives for people to, move up in their careers, and you can start with, pay schedules. In Latin America, most salary schemes do not reward any form of, lifelong learning for educators. You need to make it, and this is not just about salaries, this is about prestige, this is about careers, but I think, that's where, I see most hope actually in the good teachers that are in the system to become the mentors and coaches and the engineers of the system, not in some other. The other thing is just too slow and too heavy. And often what we also see is if you educate, a great teacher in a new program and you put them in a non-functioning school, the school will win every time. I think you can very quickly destroy that new mindset and culture in an old-fashioned institution. So I think, it's, and again, I think it's very worthwhile, and if you don't like, Vietnam, you can look at Cambodia. They're 10 years later starting on that same avenue, and they will achieve the same kind of progress, I would imagine.
Andrea.
Yes, we only have a little bit of time left, but I did want to ask you, Andrea, given the influence that that your work has had and the OECD, have you thought about nudging people with two issues? One is beginning to assess younger children, so actually starting assessing kindergarten through third grade. And also, have you thought about assessing multilingual learners? So thinking about how you could assess Indigenous and or immigrant children in more than one language. Thank you. Wonderful talk.
Yeah, the multilingual learning we actually do in PISA. The PISA assessment in countries, we offer for countries to do that in multilingual form. And some countries actually doing this. On the younger cohort, that is certainly feasible. I think we haven't had the kind of level of resources that you would need to do that well. I must also admit that some of the ideas and concepts that we use in PISA are much harder to implement for younger children. But I actually think, it's certainly something possible.
Malva, you get to ask the last question.
Thank you. And it's such a responsibility to have the last question. First of all, like all the other interventions, thank you so much, Andreas, for reading data for us in such a challenging way. You pose so many questions and things to think about. Well, I was particularly interested in what you said about family support and the role it plays in learning. I'm part of a private initiative in Chile that promotes family involvement, but we have observed a very low impact in the years, the ages we are working with. What do you think about changing the relationship between schools and families? I don't see family involvement really. They are interested, but they do not know how to do. With our data, you think you wonder if it deserves the work we have been developing with schools and municipalities. And what about 15 years old?
Yeah, I think it's a very pertinent point, and unfortunately, our data show that it's going backwards in most education systems. We see a decline, and parents increasingly become clients rather than participants in educational processes. The difficult part in that is that the only countries that do that well are the ones where they make teachers the gatekeepers. Now, this is very, very hard to do with other people. Where teachers do not have the time, the interest, and the possibilities to really look after parents is very, very hard to achieve. This is where Northern Europe is very good at. Some of the East Asian countries are very good, but as a teacher, you teach a lot less in those countries, and you have a lot more time to work with parents, with your colleagues, with students, and also. In those countries, you cannot outsource those responsibilities. They don't have, psychologists or social workers in schools. It's actually the job of teachers. And those are the only education systems where we can see that being done successful. But I also need to run into another meeting right now, and it was a great pleasure to join you here.
Thank you so very much, Andreas. It was great. Thank you all. Renata, do you want to close this meeting?
Just to thank Andreas again. You really raised so many more questions for us, and I think we're all going to have a much deeper read of this latest PISA report. Thank you so much. We'd love to be able to invite you again another year. All the best. And Fernando, thank you so much for bringing Andreas to us and for agreeing to moderate this topic, which is a topic that you've spent a career on working. So
thank you so much. Bye, everybody.
Take care, all, and what a great group.
Thank you, Renata. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.